Tired of looking at the same old desktop PC? Well then, it might be time to spice things up and proudly display your PC parts while simultaneously saving space by using a desk PC. So the problem is, pre-built desk PCs can be pretty expensive, so you know what that means. DIY. So yeah, in this video I'm just going to walk you through my process of building a totally tricked out desk PC. So the idea here is pretty simple. I have a softwood baseboard that's 3 feet by 2 feet with a thickness of 3/4 of an inch. This baseboard will have all of our parts mounted on it with some wood siding tall enough to clear the components. To mount the siding, I put threaded inserts in the siding at equal intervals, 4 inserts on the shorter sides and 5 on the longer sides. Then you can line up the siding with the baseboard and drill a through hole in the baseboard large enough to accommodate the screw. The screw size I'm using is a 1/4 inch 20. Make sure the screw you use is long enough to go through the baseboard and screw into the inserts. Optionally, you could countersink the screw head for neatness. Unfortunately, a few of my inserts didn't line up, so I ended up just skipping those, and it was still structurally sound afterward. By the way, I painted the wood by first applying 2 coats of primer, then following it up with a couple of coats of white water-based paint, and finishing it off with some polyurethane for protection. The polyurethane gives the white painted wood an amber yellow tinge, so if you prefer aesthetics, don't use this, but if you want longevity, I would use this to seal it. With the siding mounted, you can see the project taking shape. However, what are we going to do about the cooling in a form factor like this? Well, the general idea is to have 2 fans on the left pulling air in, with 2 fans on the opposite side pushing air out, causing cool air to flow over the motherboard and graphics card, which will be mounted right in between those banks of fans. The power supply will also require cool air, so that will be mounted face down in the right hand corner. I'll mount my hard drive right here, and to fill out this space here, I'll throw in an extra fan. And we'll have a power button right about here in the bottom left to turn the PC on. Anyway, back to fans. The way I made the cutouts was by using a 4.5 inch hole saw attachment for a drill. If you have a router, this process will be way easier and less finicky. As for dust filtration, I used some dust filters that will just be screwed in with the fan. For screwing in the fans, I used some partially threaded wood screws. As you can see, I need to use a fan head splitter since my motherboard didn't have enough fan headers. For the motherboard, I used a normal ATX form factor, meaning it has 9 screw holes. Now, the way I mounted it is similar to how I mounted the siding, and that's by popping in 632 threaded inserts in the wood using standoffs to elevate it, and then screwing it in place. The issue is that it's very hard to line up all the screw holes because even if you mark them perfectly, it's unlikely that it will be drilled that way or that the threaded inserts will go in absolutely straight. Basically, screw in as many as possible. The cutout you see on the side here is for the motherboard I/O to peek out through, and I didn't bother with trying to get the I/O shield to fit because it's way too much work for no function in return. For those wondering, these are my specs for the system. It's crucial to make sure your cooler is low profile enough to make it below the siding. By the way, you could use an AIO to cool the CPU and put the radiator and its accompanying fans where these fans are right now. Just make sure that the tubes don't stick up above the siding. So after popping the RAM sticks, the M.2 SSD, the CPU and its cooler, we can drop in and screw down the motherboard. So you might have noticed that you can't mount the graphics card in a traditional fashion, so I just use this relatively cheap 40cm riser cable because some of the risers can get really expensive, especially from name brands. Just like for the motherboard, I made an I/O cutout, but to accommodate for the bracket, I made a little divot, which will also aid in securing the card. That isn't enough to keep it locked down, so I pushed the bracket against the side via 2 screws with washers to go over the bracket. And to prevent big-time card sag, I placed a block under the end of the card. Just be careful while handling your card because buying one of these at MSRP these days is about as rare as finding a McD's with a working ice cream machine. For mounting the hard drive, I used a cage from my old case because I just didn't feel like wasting time in plastic 3D printing one, but you could just mount it down using right angle brackets, or if you have a 2.5 inch SSD, it's even easier since you can use double-sided tape if you want. Just like for the GPU, I had to get a little creative with the mounting method for the PSU because the height of the siding is barely more than the power supply's height. So I screwed down a right angle length behind the PSU and 2 screws to the side to hold it in place. I plugged in all the cables on this side at this point. So that's the 24-pin, the 8-pin EPS, the PCIe power, and the SATA cable for the HDD. I'll use some cable extensions later to avoid looking at those hideous braided ketchup and mustard cables. At this point, we're basically done and we can plug in all the cables for the power button, the data cable for the HDD, etc. You may have noticed that I have a Wi-Fi card installed with the antennas skillfully taped to the side. Some final touch-ups you could do are adding a kind of a hood to hide these cables and adding front I/O for additional connectivity. So to turn this into a desk instead of leaving it essentially as a huge PC, I screwed this whole assembly into a desk I already had. So basically I replaced the wood piece that was already on the frame with the PC. Now if you don't already have a desk to use, you could always buy the table legs separately. Now for the cherry on top, or rather the glass on top. So yes, while tempered glass is expensive, especially during the current shortage we're in, it does bring the build together and make it unique.